Um, I am so delighted and honored to be able to introduce briefly Anal Shah, who's someone that I've actually known for a long time. But I'm really, really grateful to Sally Stein for actually bringing this recent body of work of Anal's to our attention. She got in touch with Filmforum, and I'm so glad she did because I'm very moved by the films that we're going to be watching tonight. Anal Shah is a filmmaker, photographer, musician, and teacher. There's a lot that I have to say about this work, but virtually nothing that I'd like to say before you actually watch it, at least from my end. But I'm really looking forward to our conversation that we'll have. And what we'll do is we'll drop a link to a private Vimeo in the chats, and you should have received it by brown paper ticket as well. But if you haven't already, we'll put it in the chats. And I'll say a few words. We'll go watch the films, and then we'll come back for Q&A at 9. We'll leave this webinar open, and we'll return for Q&A at 9 p.m. Anal screened his work internationally, including at the Vienna International Film Festival, Ann Arbor Film Festival, Portland Experimental Documentary Festival, and many, many others. And we are so honored and delighted to have him at Los Angeles Film Forum virtually this evening. And with that, I pass to Anal.
Hey, thanks, Madison. Thank you, Adam, and thank you for inviting me. It's truly an honor, and thank you everybody for coming. I know there's a really important Los Angeles game going on right now, so I'm sorry if I'm sort of spoiling that for you, but thank you again for coming, and I can't wait, to sort of hear the response. I'm particularly sort of excited that I mean, the two films we're going to see, Chalchitra Rail Yatra and Kalari Paya 2, have been shown in the same program along with some other films, but I think it's the first time that these two films are being shown sort of as a pair, and I'm really curious and interested in hearing how they sort of have a dialogue with each other and with amongst us, So yeah, let's just watch him and then talk about him.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and put that link into the chats now. That will take you to a private Vimeo. We'll watch the two films back to back, and then we'll return here at 9 o'clock so you've got about 10 minutes of wiggle room there from the program. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay.
Format here, you should be able to use the Q&A function to ask a question if you have a question for Anal. I have a few prepared questions that I can begin with, and then we'll just have a conversation. So welcome everyone. Thanks for being here, for coming back, and Anal, what a pleasure it was to see those two films again. Thank you for sharing your work with us. So my first question for you is about some themes that I noticed playing throughout your work in general, and these are maybe like most pronounced in Chalchitra Rail Yatra, but that's obviously a movie about different kinds of journeys and transitions, spiritual, migratory, economic, cinematic even. And as I said, I've noticed this play out throughout your work. And I was just wondering if you could speak to these themes and how they surface for you.
So I had a really different experience today watching this film. I hadn't seen it in quite a few years. And I mean, yeah, in a few years anyway. And it was for the first time that it sort of dawned on me that the film is actually pretty autobiographical in many ways, and that I had never thought of. The fact that I think I've always sort of either directly or indirectly been exposed to journeys. And I mean, travel always where it involved or a journey, sort of this sort of period of this passage that was always about uh, going home. And I think in the earliest and sort of manifestation of it might have been in my childhood when my parents had separated for a very long time, and both their homes were homes, and they were not very far from each other in the neighborhood. So I would walk from one home to the other, sometimes many times a day, sometimes late at night, uh, and that was, I mean, yeah. And then in college, again, it was almost like a weekly sort of train ride or a bus ride home. And then the newest, I mean, the film that I was about to start working on in January, but now with the pandemic it's postponed for a whole year, is a film where I walk along this river and follow this pilgrimage that people take annually. An annual pilgrimage was always like part of a family sort of tradition, also I mean, it is for many Indian families. You go to this sort of place in that case, it's away from home. It's a place, where you worship annually or so. But economically, uh, you're always sort of coming across people that are, migratory, that are laborers. I mean, migratory laborers. I mean, in many ways, I feel that, I mean, now the fact that I live here in America, but it's never like home. It's really home away from home, or even within America. Just about when I started feeling at home in California, then like my work sort of took me to the Midwest, and then there was always that journey back to California. There's always that journey back to India, and when I'm in India, it's always like the journey back to America to come and work, and you sort of feel like a migrant laborer yourself. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I thought that I was making this film about like railways and journeys. I mean, it was like always this thing outside of me that I felt like I was making a film about. But in today's viewing, it really it dawned on me that like even in my music practice, there's always a sort of tonal center. There's always you always have in Hindustani music this kind of central place, which is like home, and then all your improvisations are travel from that center, where you are basically finding your way back in a way. So you're not really, even though you take these flights, the idea is to always come back. And I don't know if I have that center in my life, the way it's divided. Um, so it's also always looking for it.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to another question that I have. I think I had mentioned to you when we were communicating before the program, I was watching these films and I was reading Deleuze's book on Spinoza at the same time. And there's a really kind of ecstatic passage at the end of that book where he's really talking about truth in terms of velocities and movements. And he has this phrase that he kind of repeats over and over: relationships of stillness and motion. And as I was watching these movies, I began to think about the documentary image in a new way, not just the kind of indexical quality, the truth-telling quality of it, but also about that all the images affect one another, and that the truth is actually in the way that the images affect one another, not only within each image itself. So I wanted to ask you, when you're constructing your films, how do you go about editing them? How do you go about creating the montage, creating the rhythms, and these kind of flights and journeys to and from that tonal center? And how do you know when it's true?
I don't know if, I mean, perhaps we are talking about the same thing, but it's not some kind of truth that I think I'm seeking or trying to construct in a montage. I think but it may be just another way of describing what I think I'm doing is uh, trying to create a feeling. And so when it feels right, a lot of the editing is very, it's I mean, editing is I know there's a lot of filmmakers in the audience. I mean, we all, I mean, every filmmaker knows that editing is sort of also very physical, right? I mean, you're always kind of responding to it with your body, the rhythm of it. And so it's more of a feeling that when it feels right, then it must be true. Then that must be the sort of right amount of time for that image to be on the screen. um, and I mean, images don't exist by themselves. I mean, they only your basic editing theory, I mean, they only have meaning when they're juxtaposed against each other. And then it's always in relation. One image always sort of is in relation to another one. And I'm speaking, about the images in the film, but really, again, what I'm thinking in my head is music again. That a note isn't, it's just sound, but it really becomes music only when it sort of has another note correspond, that is either harmonically or dissonantly related to that note, and then you have a phrase or a scene or in a movie or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I find myself thinking about music a lot when I'm watching your films, and not only because they frequently do feature music, but also just the as you suggest, the way that you cut is actually very musical, and then the way that it interacts with and is in counterpoint with the music that you use is always really, really interesting. And I was thinking about that a lot when I was watching Color Pay this time. And uh, and I was also thinking about it in relation to, and specifically how different it is actually from a kind of classic of experimental cinema, which is Maya Deren's Meditation on Violence. And they both share this choreographic quality, and yet they depart from one another and are very different in some really striking and profound ways. But yeah, the musical quality of the editing and the way that then kind of informs or is informed by the dance-like quality in the martial arts itself is like really interesting. So we were talking about cinema theory, but I also know that you dedicate Chatra Relyatra to Alan Sekula, whom I know that you also studied with. And I was just wondering if you could talk about your relationship to him and or his critical and creative work and how that's impacted or intersected with your own.
Uh, So, so when I first came to America, I mean, you may know this, but I went to CalArts as an undergrad in the late '80s. I was a photography student there, and it was a school that I wanted to come to long before, since a long time before I actually even came to America. So I was like still in India years before I came here, read about CalArts, and somehow just knew that this is where I'm going to go and study eventually. And when I did come to CalArts in the late, I think it was 1986 or 87, Alan was the first person that I met, and then enrolled in the photography program. I studied with him as an undergrad, and as a very scared and intimidated undergrad. Alan had a legendary history of photography course, and then many years later, I came back as a grad student to study with him, and became his TA. So and also at a personal level, I mean, had a very close relationship with both Alan and Sally, and I don't know if his work directly influences mine, if at all. I mean, it did tremendously as a grad student, and I remember even I'd be shooting in India on some random project, that I don't even know if it's going to end up in a movie or not, and I was haunted, I mean, by these thoughts, like every day, like what would Alan think of this? Like, if I do a shot and then it was like, well, but like, what would Alan think of it? So I really had to actually work my way uh, out of that frame of mind, that I have to find my own voice. So while Alan, in obviously in a profound kind of way, had a great influence on on me at many levels, not be way well beyond an academic kind of level. As a matter of fact, I really, really think of him as one of the warmest human beings I've met. So yeah, I mean, I kind of had to I don't know, am I answering your question at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I
I mean,
just,
so my thesis film at CalArts, Lakshmi at the Gate, had many sort of incarnations of the final edit, and one of those last edits, and I used to have these, I mean, Alan would very generously gave me a lot of time reviewing those edits, and eventually I had to sort of discard a lot of the scenes in the movie that were directly a result of my conversations with Alan, because I felt that I'm trying to sort of mimic him, and I've got to find my voice. Like so yeah.
yeah, I was just realizing I don't want to refer too much to things that we haven't seen tonight, but another kind of thought that I was having while I was watching Color of Payoti this time was that and Ladakh Diary both have this structure where it kind of ends with instruction, where you kind of begin by seeing the sort of, fully formed, so to speak, but it's all practice, right? And then as it goes on, you kind of go more and more into the sort of early childhood instruction that sort of leads up to the things that you're seeing. So just thinking that in relation to teaching and student-teacher relationships and the kind of depth and profundity of that is I don't know, it's just interesting. It's interesting to think about, and it's another kind of journey, right? The journey that one has away from one's teacher as well as. I just want to invite anybody, if you have any questions, please feel free to chime in. I have some more here, but we'd really like to open this up and make it a conversation. So another question that I have then is, how do you begin a film? Which I mean in a couple different ways. So the first is just literally, how do you start the project? But also, how do you select the image that's going to let us begin the film? The kind of the first shot of the movie, so to speak, which is so striking in these two examples here tonight. And it strikes me that in your work, we're always starting in the middle of things as viewers, and then we're kind of working our way through it. And for that to happen, we have to kind of be able to slip in. And so I'm just curious, how do you choose those images that allow us to slip in?
Hmm. I'm not quite sure, Madison, how to answer that very coherently. I'll try anyway. I mean, the first image often is something that I'm emotionally attached to, that in the final edit typically sort of ceases to be the first image, but I managed to kind of slip it in one way or the other. So in case of Colory, actually was the last image in the film that was originally the first image, but I was so emotionally attached to it that I had to sort of put it in as the last image anyway. So then with Colory, the opening really was selected with the idea that I wanted to sort of suspend the revelation, as long as possible. And I mean, I was just sort of playing with how long can I keep the audience sort of wondering what the hell this is about, and that's why the extreme close-up. Well, I mean, the opening shot is that tree and that goes down, but then really the main image of the film is that extreme close-up of the teacher, and he's giving these instructions, and there's no subtitles, and so you don't know what's going on, and um, and uh, uh, how do I select films? I think there's just, I mean, if with being Indian, there's just like, I mean, or coming from India, I mean, there's just no dearth of films to be made. I think there's just too many that I have on various, like, at various incomplete projects. It's more about like, okay, now let's work on this and let's work on this, and that sort of a thing. And then by the time you sort of get to something, there's another idea that comes in, and now so yeah. I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question very well.
No, I thought it was, yeah, absolutely. Great answer. Kat writes, I'm curious about the shot on the hilltop with the two boys engaged in battle with the mountains behind them. What was the inspiration behind that?
If my memory serves me, actually now my memory does serve me right. It comes back to me. Kat, that was originally a planned shoot that was going to be really, really different. I think it was like, yeah, I was going to be somewhere else altogether, and I was going to shoot quite differently. Somehow it wasn't working out the way the light was, and the that spot really wasn't sort of doing it for us. And while all that was going on, and I was kind of bumming, like, oh, after all this, like, it's not going to work out today to shoot properly. The the clouds kind of parted, and this beautiful sort of very monochromatic kind of light peered through. So it was just done as a spontaneous kind of improv on the spot, there, and with the two colory practitioners. There wasn't any planning. It wasn't a planned shot at all. Actually, none of the shots were, if at all. I mean, that day's shoot was one of the few sort of planned things in the movie. Mostly because I felt like I wasn't getting very good images and that sort of a thing. Oh, I'm reading Berenice's.
Yeah, so Berenice writes, my second time watching the film, I'm still puzzled by why you decided to include an excerpt of the English-speaking Western-produced Attenborough biopic, complete with the he heroic figure of the white male. I know Deepa's film is in English too, but this was a way to raise money for the production, and Earth comes from a very different place than the Attenborough biopic. In other words, what is the role played by this film for you and in Indian culture?
The Attenborough movie. I mean, my first reception of the film itself was, has very little to do with the way it sort of ends up in this film. Uh, I, I, I mean, at a personal level, my reception of the film was at a time when I was still fairly young, and there were heated conversations about the film that I was sort of, I had a that I heard others, the elders, the sort of discuss, and most of all how and actually some very interesting positive sort of reading of how the character of Nehru and Sardar and Jinnah in the frame are sort of treated equally by Attenborough, with Gandhi often sort of framed in the center of the frame. And in a way, it was kind of giving agents equal agency to both the sort of Pakistani, the Muslim sort of separation, event, and so that was my sort of understanding and reception of the film originally. The reason why it's ended up in the film was because I felt that I still needed to uh, have some sort of a archive of the way what trains like early railways looked like, and it was the only film that I could find where they sort of painstakingly created this whole montage of all these trains. So I kind of had this ready-made montage, but then all the images that you see in between of what supposedly Gandhi is looking at are actually my images that I've intercut into that. And then, Deepa's film I'd worked on. So that whole scene from Deepa's film, I was on the set, working all night, helping the production designer set up the shot all night. So then, I had that very, very personal connection to the film, Deepa's film, that is. Bernice, it's wonderful to see you. I hope I've answered your question.
And that brings me to something else that I wanted to ask you about. You talked about that alternation between the fiction and the nonfiction footage.
And sorry, Madison, to interject, but I have to. It just occurs to me because Bernice, you bring up such a sort of poignant point here. It is the white male, the sort of colonial mindset. I would be lying if I said that one can just kind of wipe it off one's slate. It's I have absolutely, there's no intentionality of being colonial here, and yet it is nearly impossible to go past it. It's very, very it's yeah. Especially now, even like living here in America, it's like, yeah, and so I wonder, no, anyway, yeah, moving on.
But I think this is the it's the heart of the matter. It's the crux of the issue, right? To be making, I think you even described them as ethnographic films at some point in your in the writings that you shared with me previously. And it occurs to me that we're talking about not only poetic ethnography or ethnopoetry, which is a term I've heard, but also what does it mean to make post-colonial ethnography, right? And I guess one of the things, and of course you remark on it early in Chaltritra Rail Yatra, where you're talking about the journey, and specifically the rail journey, as a journey between not colonial and pre or post-colonial, right? But between, it's not a dichotomy or a dialectic, but you're talking about the journey between the two in that segment where you transition out of Sholay and into the ruminations on the murals and
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
And then that's related to the sequence in the Gandhi section that you were just talking about, where you're cutting nonfiction images into a fiction film in a way that actually seems to bring out the fictional qualities in the nonfiction image and reveal the indexical or documentary qualities in the fiction images. Less so in the Gandhi section because it is perhaps more fictional.
Right.
But it strikes me that, for instance, when you're cutting to Satyajit Ray, we really see the documentary qualities in those images. So it's just wondering if you could talk about this strategy, which for me, again, it's more than suddenly there's not a dialectic or a binary. I just see images as images, and that's because of the editing because of the musicality of the cutting. I was just wondering if you could talk to that a little.
So I'm still sort of also, I was listening to your question, but I was also sort of thinking further on Bernice's question, and you know, because this film was made a few years ago, it's now sort of coming back a little bit more clearly to me that and that partly answers your question now, Madison, is that one, I wanted to reimagine Gandhi's journey and sort of, you know, co-opt that as my journey through in making this film and crisscrossing the country and sort of discovering parts of, you know, parts of the country the way he may have. I mean, I'm not comparing myself to Gandhi by any means at all, but or wouldn't even. And then that section with the white male was more because I knew I was going to go into this very difficult sort of partition period of India and Pakistan, and the genocide that still is not properly acknowledged, you know, in history. I knew I was getting to a very sort of serious part of the history of the country where railways are kind of intertwined in that. I wanted to actually provide a slight relief before I go there. So I kind of thought that it was a little entertaining, that passage, and that's kind of how it ended up. Uh, to answer your question, Madison, I don't know. It's not a very conscious thing, but I think I find myself thinking about this a lot because I teach documentary among other sort of more conventional classical type, you know, filmmaking. Something that Tom Anderson would often say, that you know, all documentaries, and I'm sort of, I hope I'm quoting him accurately, but he would say something like all documentaries must have these sort of dramatic aspects of fiction, qualities of fiction, just as fiction films must have the realism of a documentary. And I don't know, that's always sort of been at the back of my mind when I'm working. Not that I'm looking for dramatic qualities necessarily, or even sort of in the editing portion, but it might sort of creep in that way, I guess. And the idea in Chalchitra was to fuse fiction with my images, you know, as seamlessly as possible, and where one couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, well, to me, it seems like it's very successful in that endeavor, and I even think that there's a pretty magical quality. And it was repeated viewing. I mean, it's very pleasurable to watch through once, and it was repeated viewing that actually I got to see that sometimes the images even turn. They're really frequently doing more than one thing. It's not, again, it's not that there's a binary, but you can actually watch a certain image kind of switch between these different, you know, polarities, if you will. I'm thinking of the moment after Sholay, where the end theme music continues to run for quite some time over a documentary, you know, footage, you know, from your journey on the train. And then as that fades out, the kind of ambient sounds fade in and your voiceover fades in. And that's actually how we transition to the murals section. But you watch basically a documentary image go from being sort of fictionalized to then representing something else. So they shift. They partake of more than one, you know, mode of signification. I don't mean to be too like academic about it, but they shift and sometimes over time, which is a pretty magical thing to watch.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, you could be, you know, and again, like these are not sort of conscious things that, you know, I've done, you know, but I think it really comes very naturally at least for me, in my sort of experience, just in being where I'm from and the way, I've grown up. I mean, you could be taking an auto rickshaw ride, I mean, in India, and having a conversation with the driver. And it's like people just seamlessly break into fictionalized stories and back into politics and again into something else. And then, it's like suddenly something is like sort of turned into a philosophical, poetic kind of, I mean, it's amazing how ordinary people, and I don't mean ordinary, I mean, but just like regular people that you meet once, and you never see them ever again, you have these deep conversations with them, and just while they're dropping you on an auto ride, a taxi ride. I mean, for anybody that doesn't know what auto rickshaws are, they're like three-wheelers. So I think it's those kinds of, this intertwining of fact and fiction and is very natural in everyday encounters, at least the way the kind of conversations I've always had, and always sometimes even looked for,
Tooney writes, the scene from Dilsey is perfection for me in this way, fact and fiction. Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions, please feel free. I think we've got one coming. I thought there was more coming.
Okay.
It could be that there's not. Yes, great. I'd like to know a little bit more about the music from the second piece. Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, the second piece was always conceived to be made with Kerala percussion, the Chenda percussion music. So it was like, that was one of the original ideas. What didn't quite work out in the end was that structurally also I wanted to sort of create the piece that was based on the rhythmic structure of Chenda percussion music. That editing wise wasn't going to work out, and I mean, it still is my dream. I mean, it's a very sort of practical dream that I really want to create a film structure that is based on a raga that follows the same kind of a structural template, where you have this alap, which is the opening, which is a really long passage that kind of introduces the various elements, and then you go through these various sort of rhythmic cycles. That didn't quite work out, so it's pointless talking about it. But otherwise, I mean, I always heard that percussion music when I started thinking about the film before I made it. So I had gone to Kerala many times before. So I was introduced to Kalari, a few times. And then the percussion music from Kerala I was introduced to many years, even before I ever went to Kerala. And Tuni, someday you can translate the Bengali, the ball song at the end of Chalchitra Rail Yatra, because I still don't know what he's singing.
Great. And more questions, please feel free to use the chats or the Q&A function. And I know you have your own musical practice, and you just mentioned that you had this long-standing desire to create a structure based on the raga. But I wonder, music has been a theme running throughout the conversation, but I was just wondering if you wanted to speak more directly to that, to the influence, either just your direct experience with music or the influence of music on your filmmaking and your art practice.
Again, I mean, what we've seen in the films today, I mean, except for the fact that percussion is such a sort of strong character in Kalari, it isn't a conscious thing. I mean, if anything, I mean, I come from photography. I even came to the graduate program at CalArts to study photography with Alan Sekula, and it was halfway in that program that I switched to film, only when I discovered that, oh, here's a medium where I can really combine my interest in music and images and sort of find a voice where I'm able to sort of speak in, with both of those. So this idea of creating a film with a raga structure, I mean, that is the only sort of really conscious kind of attempt that I still haven't successfully, achieved, realized. But no, I think it's there in terms of duration. I think it's there in terms of I yeah, I don't know how else to say. I mean, music practice at a personal level is very central to, I spend more time practicing music than creating images. Let me put it that way. So, yeah, and there's a long question here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So John writes, at the outset, Chaltritra Railiatra seems to establish a set of conceptual and structural tensions between stillness and motion, between past and present, between history and imagination, among others. Some of these tensions seem to be momentarily resolved when the film cuts back and forth between the past and present, matching on the eye lines of cinematic characters. These apparent resolves, which, as you've said, seem seamless at times, made the later cinematic representations of geopolitical violence even more unsettling and moving. I was wondering if you can talk about how you structured the film's movement through the cinematic archive as developing toward or culminating into this violence, or more generally, what informed how you structured the film's passage through India's real and cinematic history.
Yeah, thanks for that question, John. I think the answer is not terribly different than the what I said in response to Madison's first or second question about seeking truths, and what I prefer to call it when it sort of feels right. So I think when the images or the montage kind of felt like it was doing some justice to the actual sort of truth of history as one knows it, and carried this kind of intertwining of fact and fiction. I mean, like movies and then my own images, when all of them sort of just fused into feeling like it was getting whatever the intention of that, the objective of that particular event, historical event, if it's the partition or the murals, right, then I sort of let it go. And now I have to sort of give away, what you don't sort of see in the movie. So the film was edited ultimately to meet a deadline. So there was a kind of urgency to finish the film. But more than that, here's what originally the film was. The way I conceived it, there would have been no stillness. So there wasn't supposed to be the kind of contrast between stillness and motion. Like I wanted the entire film to be moving at all times. Like that once you start on this journey, everything is moving all the time until the film ends. And that didn't quite work out, again. So then the film is what, I'm going to take the liberty of sort of answering again, yet providing yet another answer to Madison, your original question, is that I in my process, I mean, it's one thing that you conceive and that you intend to make, but then once you have the footage and when you're editing, I hope I sort of allow that footage to kind of be my guide. and then I feel that the film is what that footage is sort of speaking to me, as opposed to me trying to mold that footage into the film I intended to make right from the beginning. So the film that ends up being made is often the result of what I have, and I sort of allow that, those images do something, right? I mean, when you're editing and they create their own sort of rhythm and their own meaning, and then I hopefully am open enough to kind of respond to that, and so it's never what the film was originally intended to be, and
Well, and that strikes me. I mean, you've mentioned several times the relationship to music and improvisation, right, and structure and improvisation, and that strikes me as related as well. But there's, even though it's a shot film and that there's a plan that at some point in editing, a certain level of improvisation has to enter into the equation.
yeah, I do believe that, and those images, I mean, they do different things once when you look at them again, then what you had in mind when you shot them. Not always, but very often that's the case with me. I mean, I really like this Bresson's sort of idea that when he says that the film that I shoot is, when I go into the editing room, I kill that movie, and a new film is born, in the editing room. Or the film that I write, I kill that film when I'm on set shooting, and a new film is born on the set. And I do think that a film has to kind of go through these various incarnations before it kind of, and it seldom is the film that one wrote, or in my case, the basic idea that I had for it. And that sort of answers your other question about, like, where does it, like, how do you choose your first image? How do you think of a film? And so it's often just an idea, but and then you develop that idea, and then you go out, at least I go out and shoot it, and then it's never exactly that.
And so related to that, I'm curious, do you talk about how you interact with people when you're shooting? How do you develop the relationships? How do you, it seems like such a large part of your work. I'm thinking specifically of the kind of intimate scene where the young children are helping one another get ready for practice, and they're sort of dressing one another. And you're obviously very close, physically proximal with your camera. And the whole thing is just like a really beautiful, dance again. But I know that that's not the only time that you must be developing these relationships. But I was just wondering if you could speak to that aspect of your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's different things. I wish I was spending more time than I have in several of those films, because no, I think it's just about spending time and in those places with a camera, and so there is some directing going on. I mean, at least, at the very least, letting people know, asking for permissions that I'm that I'm going to be shooting. And I mean, I even though I try and make him look like I'm just a fly on the wall, I mean, it's obviously not the case. I mean, there's but yeah, I try and intrude as little as possible. But sometimes there is some minor kind of directing going on where, I mean, I don't, yeah. And I feel that I don't know, I have some very mumbo jumbo-ish beliefs about all this kind of stuff, but I shoot a lot, and like really a lot. And I say this to students all the time, that like just shoot, 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 shoot. And just when you think you're done shooting, shoot some more. And it's always in that shooting some more where I find the images that end up in the movie. So I do think that when you work really, really hard, then something that you never ever planned sort of gets revealed. It again, I go back to the whole music thing, that you just have to practice, 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 and then, or even like the whole sort of Bressonian thing where he had his models like rehearse endless, like hundreds of times, those lines in his movies, and when you get to that point, then you suddenly have this kind of freedom, from it, where it is so internalized. And I don't claim to have that kind of freedom or internalized sort of, but I'm just saying that is generally my work mode, where I work really hard, and maybe people just see me work very hard, and then they are kind of more responsive to me in allowing me to, I'm not like a journalist that's just trying to get some shots there and like leave,
No, and I think that's evident. It's evident in the quality of the images, not just in the affect of the people as they're being photographed. But I guess, I mean, I've got Spinoza on the brain, as I mentioned, but I'm really thinking about an ethics of photography. And in Spinoza's ethics, that situation is always relational. It's anti-morality, right? It's not like these are the rules of cinema or of photographing. It's really it's like an assemblage, of people, but also of the intensities and the relations and the velocities between them. And it really comes across, not just in the editing, not just in the imagery, but in all the relationships. And it strikes me that the effect of that when I'm watching is you are present, even though, as you said, there's like a kind of fly on the wall construct, except when people are interacting with the camera, which happens, frequently. And we are present. Like we're all like the whole equation is there at every moment in the construct, it seems to me. And that's not always the case,
Yeah, and I think those specific sort of shots, it's also they're all long takes, and long takes do that. They get the audience right there, in a more natural kind of way than more kind of classical shooting.
Yeah, and then in another relation to the fiction films, the way, again, the way that you use Ray, and the qualities that you bring out of that. Molly writes, in Chalchitra Reliatra, I was wondering if there was a reason for the chronological span of cinema footage that you pull from, in the sense that you do not seem to pull from films past the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, because I thanks for that question, Molly. Mainly because my sort of relationship with the cinema that I grew up with ended in the 90s. I stopped. I mean, I grew up watching those movies that are in the in this film, and then Ray, of course, a little bit later when I was in college. But I the day, I mean, not to the day, but when Hindi cinema became Bollywood, that's when I lost interest. I don't respond to Bollywood at all. I grew up with Hindi cinema, and as we knew it in the 70s and earlier. So, and I think maybe it's because those films sort of stopped being about India. Suddenly fantasy was Switzerland and not a hill station, outside of Bombay or something. Like maybe the imagination of those films kind of internationalized in a different way that in a way that I couldn't relate to. I don't know.
Mariko writes, I'm curious to hear how your practice of making and seeing photographic images have tapped into your practice of filmmaking.
Not, I think it's the same. I don't think they're that different. I mean, I'm somebody that, I photograph on a daily basis almost. And so then when I make images for a project, it doesn't feel like one is informing. It just feels like, what I do anyway. I mean, I in this day and age, I mean, I post images on Instagram like almost on a daily basis. So it's like a diary anyway, that for me to kind of create images and to be always like looking and composing and finding some kind of a visual sort of relationship somewhere in the world. So
Yeah, and of course there's that amazing opening where you say it's the dream of every still image.
oh yeah.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, yeah. That was just very lucky to have I mean, I knew of the Salgado image quite very, very well as a photographer, but also because that image has been copied by other Indian photographers, and I at some point actually wanted to write about that image as well. It so happens that I was an assistant to a photographer for many years. Incidentally, Deepa Mehta, whose film is in Chalchitra, her brother is a major photographer, Dilip Mehta. I was his assistant for many years, and Dilip and Sebastio Salgado originally started an agency called Contact Press Images. So I worked at Contact Press Images as a photo assistant. So I was kind of familiar with that whole sort of body of work in some ways. And then the image of the moving, that's from 27 down. So that was just lucky me to have found like an image created, I think, at the same railway station. And I did want to put in the fact that the Lumieres make, arrival of a train, and within 2 years, I mean, there was a film made at Churchgate Station in Bombay that was essentially copying Lumiere's film.
Yeah, that's an amazing scene for many reasons, but not the least of which, because as you've just said in that answer there, on the one hand, we're starting in the middle of things. We're starting a cinematic essay with a still photo, and we're back to the beginning. The origins of cinema, and and it all happens in a span. And I didn't realize that the overlay images from 27 down. So you've also got the combination of fiction, film, and documentary photography right there. And I just love this idea that the images, it's not the dream of the photographer, it's the dream of the image. I love the idea that images have desires and that images have dreams. And again, it takes me back to ethics. Are there, I don't want to keep you too late. I know you're on a different time zone than we are, but are there any final questions? Or do you have any final thoughts, anything that we haven't been able to address that you wanted to address?
No, I mean, thanks again for inviting me. And I really want to thank everybody that's sort of patiently watched and listened to the conversation, asked questions, and yeah, so thank you so much. And I hope the Dodgers win.
They won. There was fireworks. It's better than Twitter. We've got an auditory alarm system for when the Dodgers win here in Los Angeles. Great. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Anil. It's such a pleasure.
And I'm okay. People are leaving, but I'm just noticing that there's several friends and teachers in the audience. So thanks again. Like, it's good to see everyone.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful to have this evening with you, and we hope to see all of you in 2 weeks for our next online event.